Hi, folks. Here we are going to pretty much coming to the end of our course and coming to an extraordinarily important way in which we conclude it. Now, before I start some of the content, I want to tell you that we're going to divide this into a couple of sections. So if you need to get a cup of coffee or something in the middle of it, you know that there's going to be some natural breaks. But before we begin, I'm going to tell you an anecdote. Several of you told me that you like when I tell anecdotes, so I'm going to begin with one, and which one I think leads into this story. So, as you know, I was the head of a pretty large, well-known foundation for a number of years. Before I was selected for that, I was the headhunter that brought me in told me that I was one of three finalists, and I asked him, it was a he, I asked him what I should anticipate, and he said, well, he said the first two people had meetings that lasted about 10 or 15 minutes, so you should assume it'll be a very quick meeting, and he will be, and that's just the way he operates. He was a world figure. He ran a huge multinational corporation, meeting people for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. So you should assume that's the way things are going to go. Okay. So it turned out when I met with Edgar Bronfman, who's the person who is relevant here, when I met with him, my meeting went about an hour and a half. So I suspected something was different. And finally, at the end of our discussion, he said, "Now, do you have any question for me?" And this is kind of our lead into today's discussion. He said, "Do you have any question for me?" So I said, as they tell you to say in these things, I said, "Well, what are you looking for in this position?" So his response was, "I'm not looking for a yes man." And I sort of said to myself, well, that's good. I don't want to be a sycophant. I want to be a person whose opinions matter. I think that was a great answer until he went on to explain what he meant by it. And what he wanted to say, I need someone who's going to be able to say no to all of these many requests that we get in a very gracious manner. Now, that's not the typical understanding of what we mean by yes man, but actually, the longer I was in the position, the more I understood what he was talking about. And this is really the lead into saying yes and no and the issue of a persona. Because after all, everything else we've done in this class is behind the scenes. Everything else we've done in this class is helping us make our decision. But we only interface with the rest of the world once we have made a yes or no decision. Certainly, that's true with grantees and often with other stakeholders as well. So, in fact, how we choose to express ourselves, where we choose to express ourselves, what words we use, how we convey our persona says very much about how the world perceives us. If you go back to our session on culture, where we talked about different kinds of cultures, this is the way in which we, as an organization or as an individual, choose to have the world perceive us. And there are very specific ways in which we can make decisions about that. Saying yes and no is the most key. But before getting to that, I want to talk about some context for that. So just another anecdote to lead into it as well. I was once at a meeting hosted by quite a substantial foundation in not in New York where I was living at the time, but another city. And the meeting was hosted by this prominent foundation in their headquarters. The headquarters was a marble mansion, and I was quite convinced that before going there that this had been a private mansion that had been taken over by the foundation as their headquarters. It turned out, I discovered afterwards, that it was built from scratch for the specific purpose of the foundation. The relevant part of the story is that the heads of the foundation were talking about a frustration they had. When they built it, they specifically created space that they hoped nonprofit organizations and grantees would use once the building was finished. Much to their chagrin and disappointment, they found that none of very, very, very rarely did the nonprofit organizations or grantees ask to use the space that was made available for them. And they couldn't understand why. But if you think about it, this was in one of the fanciest parts of town of that place, of that community. If you walked into that place, think about it. You were going into a gilded mansion, a marble gilded mansion. If you were a nonprofit that worked with underprivileged or in another part of the community or an at-risk population, how comfortable are you going to be walking into that community? Not only would you have to travel from where you normally spend your time, but it made it very clear that you are not of that class. You are not of that genre. You're not an equal there. There is some way in which they're making available to you out of the goodness of their hearts a space that's really not the most comfortable place for you. So with all the good intention of that foundation, it turned out that it was never going to meet that need. And I subsequently, by the way, Judge, I don't want to be a hero here because, after all, I then look back at my own experience, and my office when I was heading that foundation was in one of the most famous buildings in the world, the Seagram building. And I was in the senior executive floor, which meant that long before security was a norm, you had to pass through security to be escorted through the topics, past the top executives to get to my suite. And I realized way after the fact that I could how intimidating it probably was for people when they came to see me and they wanted to have a conversation with me, and how, as much as I thought that I was open, as much as I thought that I was making people comfortable, the very structure and the very context in which they met me was intimidating by just by definition. So one of the things I want to say is, even before we get to the specifics of saying yes and no, is think about where you want to meet people. What message do you want to give there? How do you want people to feel safe in sharing information with you? We can say we want this to be trust-based. We can say we want this to be participatory. But if the context is intimidating, if the context suggests that there's a class differentiation between those of us who have and those of us who want, we are somehow working against our own words as much as our intentions may be ideal. So it's important that we think about location. Secondly, we have to think about whom we meet. As you know, when you meet with a smaller organization or a new startup, the likelihood is that we're going to be meeting with the principals that are doing the work. But when we meet with large organizations, such as a big museum or a big university or a big hospital, or other kinds of bigger institutions, there's a very strong likelihood that the person who's been assigned to meet with us is a development officer. And sometimes we'll find that development officers are very protective of the people that they work with, figuring that those people know how to deliver service. They don't know how to talk to people like us. One of the things that I tried very hard to insist upon is that we would meet with the people that were actually doing the work. I think that most of us understand that somebody who's an educator or a researcher, their job is not to somehow know all the jargon of what it means that in the philanthropy group. Their job is to tell us what they really want to do with the resources if they have them. It's our responsibility to learn how to hear that. And not to have it necessarily filtered or interpreted or translated through a development officer. So while it may be easier and there may be jargon and shorthands talking to a development officer who may have been the one that wrote the proposal, I found that if we really want to do effective due diligence, we want to make it a point to meet with the people who are doing the work, and preferably at the location where the work would be happening. Um, we also have a question as to where we choose to be visible. Our visibility matters. Do we want to be do we want to show up at community meetings? If we're funding in a local community, do we want to make sure that people see us there, or do we only want them to see us when they come to talk to us about funding? The danger of showing up at community meetings, as we've talked about this in the class, we're walking dollar signs. There's a vulnerability that we have when we expose ourselves in community meetings with a nonprofit world, with an NGO world, with a grantee world. Having said that, it also gives us credibility that we really care about what the community is thinking, that we're learning to listen in the context where they're sharing their views. We have to learn how to accept that people want something from us, but we also have to recognize that if we present ourselves in those locales, it gives us credibility when we have to make those hard decisions. So how we behave ourselves, where we present ourselves, can make a tremendous difference in our persona. We also should think about the other stakeholders whom we want to engage. The other stakeholders can be decision makers, they can be corporate decision makers, they can be elected officials, they can be fellow funders. We can have a tremendous influence in supporting things that we care about by having collaborative relationships with other funders. We're not talking now in shorthand about what a collaboration means or a partnership, but nevertheless, we should know and have a good relationship with others who are doing funding in the same area that we're funding. It means that we can learn from them and they can learn from us. And sometimes we can consult with them about decisions we have to make. So and finally, in terms of the persona, and we've talked about this earlier in the class, so I'm not going to spend more time on this. What are the social or reputational expectations that we have in our community? The foundation that I used to head was very prominent in many places, but certainly we were in New York City and funded many major cultural institutions in New York. Who represented the foundation and the company at certain events made a difference from a reputational perspective. But it's especially true in middle-sized and smaller communities, where the awareness of when we choose to be present makes all the difference in our credibility and the impact that we have and the influence that we have through our decision making, even as we're going to come to next, when we sometimes have to say no to recipients. So that I think lays the groundwork for the persona. Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter how we say yes, and why does it matter how we say no? Well, those are, as I started a little bit ago, how we say yes and how we say no is really, for the vast majority of organizations that we deal with, that's basically the beginning and end of relationship with us. They may send us a proposal. We may, in some cases, say yes. I'm going to come back to that. But in many cases, that yes or no is the key moment that defines the relationship. And so how we communicate that matters a lot. Um, good communication, good communication along these lines not only shares some clarity of our own decision, but it also makes our own lives easier. Makes sure that we've gone through the discipline of saying, what do we really want to say in this decision? What do we really want to say in this note? What do we really want to say in this letter? What do we want to say in that conversation? It means that we're not vague, and by not being vague, we're not conveying mixed messages to the grantees. After all, and we'll come to this a little bit later, after all, if somebody wants something from us, they're going to look at every possible way in which we communicate ourselves, communicate to see what message we're giving them. Is there a clue? Is there something hidden in the phraseology that we use to say yes or no? For example, when I first started out in that foundation had been around for a long time before I was the CEO. It had a practice, not purposeful, but every 10 years or so, its focus changed. And therefore, there were things that were funded 50 years before, 40 years before, 30 years before, that were the focus of that foundation at the time, but had long since being relevant to what we were funding today. So at the beginning, I wanted to be very direct and honest in saying this, and I would use the expression "at this time" when I would say no, because it might have been true 30 years ago. Well, that was the most unhelpful phrase that I could have used, because people would read that and say, "Huh, today, before you know us, that you're not funding it." But that's true at that time. But tomorrow, if I make a good case, you might consider it. So I found that even that very direct, honest phrase about our own history was unhelpful, because it led many of the people that didn't get funding, it led them on to think that something was to be talked about tomorrow rather than yesterday. Um, um, And finally, as well as you saw in the exit strategy section that you read or watched, it begins to it helps clarify what our relationship is. We can say with our yes and no what we want the future relationship with this organization to be, or where, how we say it, and the words that we use. So that leads us on. We're going to take a little break here before we get to the next section. Good time if you want to take a stretch, get a cup of coffee, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how you say no.
Okay. Well,